You look at your phone, a watch, or a clock on the wall, and you accept what it tells you as an absolute truth. You don't question the numbers glowing back at you. You organize your entire existence around them. You wake up when they command, you eat when they dictate, and you measure your worth by how many of them you can fill with labor. We treat time as though it is a fundamental law of physics, an invisible but ever-present force ruling over us. But the truth is far stranger. The concept of an hour, a minute, or a second doesn't exist in the natural world. Nature knows only the rhythm of the seasons, the rising of the sun, and the beating of a heart. Everything else, every ticking second, every rigid schedule, every deadline you have ever panicked over is a human invention. It is a cage we built for ourselves over thousands of years. And the story of how we captured the sun and commoditized the very fabric of our existence is perhaps the most consequential and entirely overlooked revolution in human history. Stay until the end, because what you are about to see will change everything you know. This is Voices from History, where history comes alive. Subscribe and take your place in the rank of the history. For the vast majority of human existence, our ancestors lived in a state of absolute temporal freedom. Time was not a line. It was a circle. You woke when it was light, you hunted or foraged, and you slept when darkness fell. There was no concept of being late, because there was no schedule to adhere to. But as humans transitioned from wandering tribes to settled agricultural societies, the stakes grew higher. Survival required planting crops at the exact right moment in the year. To track the seasons, ancient people built massive stone monuments, like Stonehenge in England, or the great observatories of the Maya, designed to align perfectly with the sun during the solstices. They were essentially giant architectural calendars, but someone had to be the first to slice the day itself into pieces. Thousands of years ago, in the sprawling sun-drenched empires of ancient Egypt and Babylon, priests noticed that the shadows cast by great obelisks didn't just move, they moved with absolute predictability. By tracing those shifting shadows in the sand, they realized they could track the sun's daily journey. They divided the daylight into 12 equal parts. Why 12? Because they counted the joints on their fingers using their thumb, an ancient mathematical system that would stubbornly survive all the way into the modern age. Suddenly, a day wasn't just a day anymore. It was a collection of measured, finite moments. They had created the first sundial, but there was a glaring problem with relying on the sun to tell you the time. When the sun went down, time disappeared. In the darkness, or under the cover of a thick storm cloud, humanity was blind again. They needed a way to track the hours that didn't rely on the sky. And so, the water clock, or clepsydra, was born. It was a brilliantly simple concept, a stone vessel with a tiny hole drilled into the bottom, allowing water to drip out at a constant, agonizingly slow rate. Inside the vessel, carved markings indicated the passing hours. For the first time in history, time was no longer tied to the heavens. It was brought down to earth, trapped in a jar. Ancient lawyers in the bustling courts of Athens were given a specific amount of water to make their arguments. When the water ran out, their time was up. It was the first instance in human history of time being explicitly traded for human action. But the water clock harbored a fatal flaw, one that would plunge humanity back into temporal chaos for centuries. Water freezes, it evaporates. The flow rate changes depending on the temperature and the amount of water left in the vessel. It was an inconsistent master. As great empires rose and fell in the ancient world, the quest to trap time perfectly remained elusive. And then an unexpected shift occurred. The desire to track time moved from the bustling courts and marketplaces of ancient cities to the quiet, isolated stone fortresses of medieval Europe. Within these monastic walls, monks lived lives of intense religious devotion, governed by strict rules that required them to pray at specific, rigidly defined intervals throughout the day and night. Missing a prayer was not just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual failure. They needed a reliable alarm. And out of this desperate religious necessity came a machine that would inadvertently change the world forever. It was a loud, clunky, heavy beast of iron and lead weights. It had no face, no hands, and no dial. It simply struck a bell. They called it a klocka. the Latin word for bell. We call it the mechanical clock, and the secret to its operation was a stroke of absolute mechanical genius called the verge and foliot escapement. Imagine a heavy weight tied to a rope wrapped around a wooden cylinder. If you let it go, the weight simply plummets to the ground. But the escapement was a brutal, halting mechanism that violently stopped and started the falling weight, releasing its energy in tiny, controlled, equal bursts. That sound, the relentless, mechanical heartbeat of the clock, had never been heard on Earth before. It was the sound of time being chopped into uniform, artificial slices, and once humanity heard that sound, we could never unhear it. Soon, these massive iron machines escaped the monasteries and were installed high in the towering centers of European towns. They were marvels of engineering, requiring astronomical investments of wealth and labor, and they fundamentally rewired the human brain. Before the town clock, you worked until the job was done, or until it was too dark to see. You ate when your stomach grumbled. After the town clock, a loud booming bell echoed across the fields and through the narrow cobblestone streets, declaring exactly when work began, when it ended, and when you were allowed to rest. The clock didn't just measure time, it dictated it. Ordinary people began to synchronize their lives, not with the sun, but with the machine. Time had become an authority. It looked like the story was over. Humanity had successfully mechanized time. We had conquered the hours on land, but nobody saw what came next. Because while the clock ruled the towns, the oceans remained a terrifying, untamable void where time was quite literally a matter of life and death. As the age of exploration dawned, massive wooden galleons set sail into the unknown, chasing the unimaginable wealth of new worlds. But navigating the open ocean was a deadly guessing game. To know exactly where a ship was on the globe, a captain needed to know two things: their latitude and their longitude. Latitude, your position north or south, was relatively easy to calculate by observing the height of the sun or the North Star. But longitude, your position east or west, was a nightmare. The Earth rotates, meaning the stars are constantly shifting in the sky. The only way to calculate longitude was to know the exact local time on the ship and compare it to the exact time back at your home port. The difference in hours would tell you exactly how far you had traveled. It sounded simple in theory. In practice, it was impossible. By this era, the most accurate clocks on land used swinging pendulums, but put a pendulum clock on a wooden ship pitching and rolling in the violent swells of the Atlantic, and the clock becomes utterly useless. Temperatures swung wildly from the freezing North Atlantic to the boiling Caribbean, expanding and contracting the metal gears. Saltwater humidity rusted the delicate mechanisms. The clocks failed, and because the clocks failed, ships became lost. Thousands of sailors crashed into jagged, uncharted reefs in the dead of night, their wooden hulls shredded, their lives extinguished, simply because they didn't know what time it was. The longitude problem became the greatest scientific crisis of the age. Governments were desperate. In 1714, the British Parliament offered an astronomical fortune, £20,000, a king's ransom equivalent to millions today, to anyone who could build a clock that could keep accurate time at sea. The brightest minds of a generation, including the legendary Isaac Newton, believed it was mechanically impossible. They thought the answer had to be found by mapping the stars, not in a box of gears. The real explanation wasn't discovered until much later, and it didn't come from a university or a renowned astronomer. It came from a humble, self-educated village carpenter named John Harrison. He dedicated his entire adult life to solving the impossible. Harrison realized that the clock couldn't fight the hostile environment of the ocean. It had to adapt to it. Over decades of obsessive labor, he invented internal springs that wouldn't rust, complex mechanisms that compensated for temperature changes by using different types of metal that expanded at different rates, and a frictionless design that didn't require messy oil. The result was the H4, a device that looked like an oversized pocket watch. When it was finally tested on a brutal months-long voyage to Jamaica, the scientific establishment waited for it to fail. It didn't. When the ship arrived, the H4 had lost only a few seconds. Harrison had captured time, miniaturized it, and made it immune to the chaos of the world. He had given humanity the key to navigating the entire globe. That seemingly insignificant device transformed history. It allowed empires to expand, global trade to flourish, and the map of the world to be drawn with absolute precision. But while the chronometer conquered the oceans, an even more profound temporal revolution was brewing back on land. The Industrial Revolution was igniting, spewing black smoke into the skies and replacing the quiet rhythms of agricultural life with the deafening roar of the factory. And in the factory, time was no longer just a tool for measurement. It became a weapon. For the first time in human history, human labor was systematically bought and sold by the hour. The wealthy factory owners realized that every second a machine sat idle or a worker rested was lost profit. Time was suddenly equated directly with money. The factory whistle replaced the town clock. Workers were subjected to strict, unforgiving schedules. They were fined for being a minute late. Their days were tracked on punch cards, turning human existence into a strict ledger of hours and minutes. The psychological shift was violent. People were forced to internalize the ticking clock. They learned to feel a deep, gnawing anxiety when they were wasting time. The natural rhythms of the human body were subjugated to the relentless pace of the machine. The very concept of free time was invented, simply because all other time was now officially owned by someone else. It solved one problem: maximizing industrial efficiency while creating another. As the modern world accelerated, a new monster emerged: the railroad. Trains tore across continents at unprecedented speeds. But as they traveled, they ran into a bizarre, chaotic reality. Every single town in the world still kept its own local time, based on exactly when the sun was highest in their specific sky. When it was noon in Washington, D.C., it was 12:12 in New York and 11:43 in Ohio. There were hundreds of conflicting local times across a single country. For a farmer walking behind a plow, this didn't matter. But for two massive steel locomotives hurtling toward each other on a single track, a 2-minute discrepancy meant a catastrophic, explosive collision. The world was moving too fast for local time, and so the railroad companies decided to simply erase it. In a stunning display of power, they divided whole continents into massive, artificial time zones. Suddenly, millions of people were ordered to set their clocks not by the sun above their heads, but by a standardized corporate dictate. High noon no longer meant the sun was at its absolute peak in the sky. It just meant the hands on the clock said 12. The ancient, sacred connection between human time and nature was permanently severed. Humanity had fully adopted a shared hallucination. And then everything changed again in the 20th century. The brass gears and springs of John Harrison gave way to the silent, invisible vibration of quartz crystals, making accurate watches so cheap that almost every human on Earth could afford to wear one on their wrist. But even that wasn't precise enough for the modern world. Today, the world is governed by atomic clocks. They measure time by tracking the microscopic microwave signals that electrons emit when they change energy levels within a cesium atom. It is an unfathomably precise measurement. A modern atomic clock will not gain or lose a single second in over 100 million years. This microscopic precision is the invisible scaffolding of modern civilization. When you use your phone's GPS to navigate to a restaurant, you are actually receiving time signals from a network of satellites hurtling through space. The receiver in your hand calculates your location by measuring the microscopic difference in the time it takes for those orbital signals to reach you. Global financial markets execute thousands of trades in a single millisecond. The entire internet, the power grid, global telecommunications, they all rely on this perfectly synchronized atomic heart. If the world's atomic clocks were to drift out of sync by even a fraction of a second, the global economy would collapse. Planes would be grounded in midair, and modern infrastructure would blind itself. We have journeyed from tracing shadows in the ancient sand to counting the invisible vibrations of atoms in a vacuum. We stripped time from the heavens, imprisoned it in water, locked it in heavy iron gears, miniaturized it into brass pockets, and finally digitized it into an inescapable grid that wraps around the entire planet. We believed we were mastering the universe. We thought that by naming the hours and slicing the seconds, we were taking control of our destiny. But look around. Look at the anxiety we feel when we are running late. Look at the desperate ways we try to save time, as if it were a physical currency we could hoard in a vault. We didn't capture time. Time captured us. We built the most magnificent, precise, and inescapable cage in human history. And then we gladly locked ourselves inside. The sun still rises and sets, entirely indifferent to our schedules. But down here, under the relentless ticking of the clocks we built, we will forever be racing against a master of our own invention.